Hello and welcome back. This is the Low Budget Frame Jig series video number 2. In the last video, we reviewed the plans for this jig in 3D software. I'll throw up a link in the corner to that video if you're interested in watching that first. Otherwise, stick around. In this video, we'll construct the main frame of the jig. Let's get started. If you watched my last video, you'll know that I had intended to build the outer layer with MDF. But as you see here, I changed my mind and went with 3/4 inch birch plywood. If you end up building this jig, I recommend doing the same because for around $25 more, you'll extend the strength and life of your jig. But if MDF is your thing, it's really up to you. Okay, so before I get too far, I should explain the types of cuts I'll be making first. The base of the jig is an L shape with the spine's length coming in at 5 feet by 6 inches. The neck is 3 feet tall by 4 inches. My first cuts will be 1 inch outside the final dimensions of the jig. That's the dotted line you see in the diagram. I chose to do this for 2 reasons. The first, my final cuts will be made after the 3 layers of plywood are glued together, and second is kind of hard to explain right now, but I will show you guys that later in the video. Okay, on to the first cut of the day. Took me a while to get to this cut. I was being really careful because I always get paranoid when I'm laying out lines to make cuts on plywood because plywood's not cheap. And, you know, when you're making a cut across a whole piece of plywood, if you do it wrong, you just messed up a whole piece of plywood. So I double checked all my lines at least 3 times before making the cut. Alright, so there's my first piece. It is free. This is the center 1/2 inch plywood piece, and I only need 1 of those. And now I'm using that 1/2 inch plywood piece to roughen my lines for the 3/4 inch thick plywood pieces. Okay, first cut on the 3/4 inch plywood. And cleaning up the edge of that first piece, the first 3/4 inch plywood piece. And I cut the other one off camera because, you know, watching me cut lots of plywood's kind of boring. So here's the 3 pieces, all with that 1 inch padding around the edge. Okay, so now I'm working on making a series of really straight plywood strips. Let me show you guys why I'm doing this. Let's cue up the diagram music. So these blue strips represent the strips that I'm cutting, and they need to be really straight because I'm using these to attach to the jig itself. They will attach to that 1 inch padding I left around the edge of the jig. And these will be used at the time when I glue the 3 pieces together. I will screw these onto the jig, and those will hold it straight. And to prevent twist on the neck and the spine, I will use a similar technique, but I will orient the board diagonally so that it's connected to the spine and the neck. And when these get fastened, at the time when the 3 pieces are placed together and being glued, it should theoretically hold everything straight. And now I'm checking to make sure I pick the straightest side. And once I have the side that I think is the straightest, I'm putting these arrows on that edge so that when it comes time to screw these onto the jig, I know which side to use. And as a final prep, I am cutting about 1 inch off the ends of each of these strips. And the reason for that is when you're making a cut, usually at the start and the end of the cut, it's you're a little wobbly and the line isn't that straight. So I'm eliminating any non-straightness. Alright, we are ready for the glue together process. Here I'm clamping the 3 pieces together and marking 1 inch around the edge. And I'm doing this because I'm going to pre-drill all the holes necessary to hold this thing together. Here I'm placing 3 screws to index the 3 pieces of plywood together. I will take these out later on. And now I'm checking the position and marking the diagonal piece. And more pre-drilling. Alright, here's the other side where the drill poked through and it left kind of a lump of wood, so I'm countersinking those. And that's because when I place these strips or glue these strips onto the other side, I want the contact of these strips to be as flat on the surface of the jig as possible so that the jig aligns itself properly. Here I am, more pre-drilling, lots of pre-drilling. And I realized that I needed a slightly larger drill, because when I fasten the screws through this jig, they need to extend through and then onto the straight strips that I created. And I can't have the screws getting caught up on the jig itself. I'm removing the index screws. And now I will get it ready to glue the pieces together. So the only regret I had is not putting more glue. I kind of wish I put more glue so that when I stuck the pieces together, it was like oozing out the edges, but it never did that because I didn't put enough glue. And the process of getting the screws back into the jig and getting my straightener strips, I guess that's what I'll call them, that took a while, and this glue sets in like 30 minutes. And by the time I was done, I was a little worried, like, oh no, did the glue dry or did I put enough? And I didn't sleep very well that night. But yeah, you guys will see what happens later. It ended up being okay. But just a word for you guys, when you get to this point, put plenty of glue. Okay, I'm getting my last couple pieces attached. And I ended up adding more holes and some more screws to secure it even more. And here it is, all set up and ready to dry overnight. And here we are the next day. I will be taking these strips of wood off and getting it ready to make my final outer cuts. With the strips removed, I noticed that the heads of these screws had caused the wood to splinter in that area. So I flattened it out with a hammer. And that's important because when you get to the point where you have your saw, if you have a circular saw and you're making those final cuts, you don't want the splinters to push the surface of the saw up. Alright, here I am making very precise lines, those 1-inch lines. I'm doing it on the outer edges of the jig. And after I make these cuts, I will then place my other lines on the inner edge. And finally, I am making my outer cut. I decided to get the straight edge on there to make this cut as straight as possible. And my straight edge wasn't quite long enough. But that's alright, made it work. And I had to go really slow because I was cutting through 3 layers of plywood, and it was pretty tiring. I had to take breaks and then start cutting. So if you're making this cut yourself, don't be afraid to stop, take breaks, and continue on. So you can see here, I'm just kind of winging it. I'm not using the straight edge anymore, and that was partly because I had no place to put the straight edge. There just wasn't enough surface to clamp it down. And the other part is it was just a pain. So I just kept real steady and got it as straight and close to that line as possible. And here I am back in the garage. Got my trusty old jigsaw out, and I will make this circular cut. And this took really long. It took so long that I had to speed up the video to 400x. And as you can see here, the cut ended up being not so great. And I will show you guys why that happened in a little bit. I'm marking my radius here. And here's why that happened. I had not set the jig up so that the blade was straight, as you can see. And so I straightened the blade out, and I made this cut. But I guess a word to you guys, and you probably already know this, jigsaws are not great for these sorts of cuts. Like this is a this is a 2-inch thick. I'm cutting through 3 layers of plywood at 2 inches thick, and the blade on a jigsaw is pretty wobbly. As you can see here, I had to flip the jig over and just kind of like clean up the other side. It just wasn't pretty. So with that said, if you have a jigsaw and you're thinking that you'll use it to make every single cut, I highly encourage you not to do that. The jigsaw it's good for certain things, but not for making most of these cuts. You definitely want a circular saw for these straight cuts. Oh yeah, so here's a little piece I had cut off, and I thought it'd be fun to try to break it with a hammer and see where it would break. It broke mostly in the middle, with a little spot where it didn't, but I was pretty satisfied. I think the glue set up pretty well, and my night of no sleep was for nothing. Alright, so I gave up on the jigsaw. Here I'm using the circular saw to just kind of make straight cuts off the corners there. And here's that inch that I need to take off on one of the ends. I think that's the neck. Might be the spine. And just cleaning up the ends and rounding off the corners. And that is a wrap. We will stop here for now. Let's tally up the damage so far. We've got 1 sheet of 3/4 inch thick 4x8 foot birch plywood coming in at $45. 1 sheet of 1/2 inch thick 4x8 foot birch plywood at $25. And glue, $7. Our total at this time is $77. I hope you all enjoyed this one. In the next video, we'll get some kind of sealer on this currently naked jig, and most likely get started on the head tube fixture section. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.